Hey folks, Brian Bledsoe with you here once again, host of the Desert Farmer Podcast. Thanks so much for being with me today. It is Wednesday, January 14th, and I first of all want to extend a great deal of thanks to all of you that watched or listened to the last episode of the Desert Farmer Podcast. Talked a lot about the long range pattern, a lot about what the PDO could do for the rest of 2026 and even into 2027. Got a lot of great feedback on that, so I really appreciate you sending that feedback back into me. So today we're going to do a little bit of a shorter episode, but it's also going to really be important to folks that are sensitive to the wind over the next several days, because that's kind of what the pattern is shaping up to be. So let's go ahead and get down to business here. And this is important, I think, for folks that live in the Western High Plains, certainly, but also live really anywhere across the entire country, because we're going to have kind of two different extremes going on across the United States. But first of all, let's look at our forecast. Upper level weather pattern from the 15th through the 20th. And this will start out tomorrow morning. And obviously, we've got a big trough of low pressure here across the eastern part of the country. We've got another piece of energy that's up here over south central Canada. This one right there is going to be responsible for producing a lot of wind over the last couple of days of this week. We've got the big ridge out here over the west. So you can kind of see what the pattern is doing, really. Kind of diving in like this. Okay. And then the secondary piece of energy kind of dives in like this and then right down like that. So if you are out here in the West, this is a less than ideal weather pattern to bring any sort of wet weather to the western part of the country, which, the first few days of this month were exceptionally wet across all of California. In fact, that 2 to 3 week period of time from December and early January was largely responsible for removing a lot of the drought that was residual drought, I should say, across California. But this is the pattern right now, which is in stark contrast to what they were dealing with out there. So putting this into motion, and I'll let this recycle a couple of times here so you can watch it. But you see that this pattern just kind of locks itself in. And really, this trailing piece of energy that dives into this trough across the Midwest, the Mid South, northward of the Great Lakes is going to reinforce a good deal of cold air across the upper Midwest, Great Lakes, and Northeast. And while that's doing so, it's going to produce a pretty windy scenario here right through this corridor. All right. And even areas farther east of that line that I drew on there are going to see some pretty significant wind from time to time out of this pattern. But the farther southwest you go, this pattern is about as benign as you get for this time of year. You're under the influence of this ridge that's out here on the west coast. You're not seeing any significant moisture chances. The temperatures aren't that bad. All the real active weather is positioned across the eastern half of the United States, and especially the eastern third of the United States on up into Canada. So the wind gust potential with this, and I'm going to go through these next few days here, is really important to really anybody that's through the plains, because any of the vegetation that is dormant still, which is basically everything, is dry and would be very easily able to burn if we were able to get a wildfire going. So this is what our wind gust potential looks like on Thursday. Ahead of that next little wave, this is going to be where your highest end gusts are, especially up here across eastern Montana, the western Dakotas, and northeast Wyoming. The farther southeast you go, still some significant wind, just not as high end as areas farther to the north. So fire danger conditions, you bet. For anywhere that is not covered by snow, which is the majority of the region, is not covered by snow, and is going to be under the influence of those winds. This is just a little bit of a tune-up. If we look ahead to Friday, look at those gusts on Friday. Especially from western South Dakota, eastern Wyoming, western Nebraska, north central and northeast Colorado, northwest Kansas. Some of those higher end gusts in the 50s likely extend all the way to Dodge City and even in the northwest portions of Oklahoma here. But it's really these areas that say Cheyenne, Torrington, Chadron, Scottsbluff, Sidney, down toward Ray, Yuma, Burlington, Imperial, McCook, Goodland, Atwood, Kansas, Scott City, Colby, North Platte. All of those areas are going to see significant wind on Friday. And that, I didn't even mention some areas up here over northwest South Dakota. In fact, this corridor right here that I have circled probably see wind gusts around 70 or so during the first half of the day on Friday. So these areas here under the influence of high fire danger, blowing dirt, so on and so forth. You know the drill. We see wind events like this many different times from fall, winter, and through the spring. So it's not something that we are a stranger to, but it's certainly something you have to be prepared for. And I can't underscore this enough that these areas here, all right, that are going to be seeing those higher end wind gusts, even with the relatively cooler air that's coming in here, that vegetation is still going to burn if it's ignited. And I'm specifically talking about grass and brush this time of year. And the farther southeast you go, temperatures are a little bit warmer. So these areas right here, okay, I would say probably have the highest end fire danger situation during the daytime hours on Friday. I'm talking to you folks specifically over west and southwest Nebraska, northeast Colorado, and the western part of Kansas, especially northwest Kansas right there. If we look at what happens on Saturday, we're still dealing with wind. All right. Not as bad as it was the day before, but you can easily see wind gusts across the region here running between about 30 and 45 miles per hour. Cheyenne still gusting up there close to 50 right there during the daytime hours on Saturday. So wind is still an issue. On Sunday, we reload the pattern. So the same areas that saw nasty wind before, see it again. Eastern Montana, all of the Dakotas, the majority of Nebraska, Northwest Iowa, up here into Minnesota. These areas here are also under the influence of some cold air. So the wind chill values there are going to be less than nice for those regions. The farther south you go, not as much wind, as these northern areas. And then if we look ahead toward Monday, all right, a lot of us settle down in terms of wind. It's still breezy. It's just not as windy as before. So those are the real days that we have to be prepared for. And even into Tuesday, we see some of that wind reinvigorate here up across far southeast Montana, western South Dakota, and on up here into southeastern portions of Wyoming. And eventually in this pattern, some of those pieces of wind energy advance far enough south to where it pretty much gets all the plains. So it's just a pattern we're going to have to watch pretty closely. The precipitation anomaly forecast from the 15th through the 20th looks about what you would expect. Again, drier out here across the west. Many areas in the Pacific Northwest, California getting shut out with this pattern. But we also have dry anomalies all the way across the eastern part of the country. All right, from East Texas all the way into the Northeast. And these areas here across Arizona, New Mexico, West Texas, Eastern Colorado, keep in mind, these areas are dry this time of year anyway. So just because you're not seeing brown there doesn't mean that you're seeing, great conditions. It just means that the dryness, the dry anomaly hasn't been dry enough for the time of year to trigger the brown shading that comes in. So I still think that whole area is largely drier than average for that 5-day period. The forecast temperature anomaly, about what you would expect too. We are warmer in the west and we are much colder in the east as that cold air continues to dive in like this. All right. And even areas out here in the far southeast, you're seeing some pretty chilly stuff. East and southeast Texas, you probably see some cooler stuff too, but areas out here to the west underneath that ridge, that's where you're going to continue to see warmer than average conditions. And you might say, well, what about these areas here up across southwest portions of Canada, eastern Montana? Well, hey, that wind, that's not coming like this with that cold air. Those are Chinook winds. All right. So you're seeing a lot of this coming off the mountains, which is responsible for producing the warmer than average conditions. And snow cover is pretty much non-existent for the majority of those areas. So that dry, bare ground, that heats up better. You see the wind stirring it up. You've got sunshine, so on and so forth. But that's what it looks like from the 15th through the 20th. Let's look at the weather pattern the 21st through the 26th, because here's where we start on the 21st. Pattern's pretty much the same as what we've been dealing with, just a little bit flatter. We still have that big cold trough of low pressure over northeast Canada, dropping down into the Great Lakes and in the northeast. The ridge is positioned out west. But watch how the pattern changes here during that 5-day period. The trough up here over eastern Canada kind of retrogrades a little bit back to the west across central and western portions of Canada. Some of that energy clips the northwest portion of the country into the northern Rockies and northern plains, and that inevitably will cool things off back in that part of the world. All right. But if you live down here to the south, southeast California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, that flow largely is still coming in from the Pacific, especially at the end of this forecast period where that ridge axis gets organized again down here across the southwest Gulf of America and also down over central portions of Mexico. That ridge will start to build and influence that southern tier of the country too. So when we look at the forecast precipitation anomaly from the 21st through the 26th, this is what you get. Again, less dry out in the northwest versus the previous 5 days. All right. You are wetter in this corridor than what you were, in stark contrast to what we were dealing with before. But you really don't see any wet anomalies here extending from Southeast California, Arizona, New Mexico, most of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Eastern Colorado. I still think that that pattern is largely drier than average for those locations. All right. Farther north, I suppose there could be better opportunities through this corridor to get some snow out of this, but it's still not an above average, wetter than average type of pattern, even for that part of the world, with the way this is situated. And most of California, in fact, is still showing up drier than average, even during that period of time. It'll be interesting to see how it changes because I do expect changes in this part of the forecast. That trough over, Canada is too dynamic not to give some fluctuation in the pattern here during this 5 day period. But I wanted to show it to you anyway. The temperature anomaly for that time frame looks like this. As I said, you get colder back here to the west as that trough retrogrades back to the west, and you're able to dump some colder air through these corridors here into the northern Rockies, into the northern plains, but back here to the southwest and across the southeast, you are still not under the influence of that trough for the most part. Your air is coming in pretty much Pacific oriented to where you're not dealing with much cold. And I've been talking about this for the past several months that there would be a very healthy temperature gradient, okay, from central Iowa back here through the panhandles. And this pattern is really the epitome that reinforces that gradient where you're much colder northeast and much warmer back to the southwest. All right. So that's kind of how we're stacked for the next couple of weeks, obviously with some changes that can likely take place from time to time. But let's take a peek beyond that. Let's look at the Copernicus 3 seasonal forecast model. The Copernicus 3 takes into account a lot of different seasonal models. And it puts that information all together. It averages that outcome. And I think it's interesting that we look at what it's doing in terms of the forecast for the ENSO, the El Nino and Southern Oscillation. So these different lines here represent all these different members of these models. The European models taken into account. We've got Meteo France in here. We've got our own, the National Center for Environmental Prediction. We've got the JMA Japanese model. We've got the Bureau of Meteorology out of Australia. Obviously, all of these different models take into account. So let's look at the initialization here. All right. So we're right there in weak La Nina territory. And look at the spread here initially where it was for January. All right. When it was issued. Look at that spread there initially. We are not going to end up way down here. We're just not. And we're probably not going to end up way up here for January. So reality is probably on the higher end of that from where we are. And then we come out here, all right? If you want to average things out, that's your average. But look at the high end of that. We've got some of these members of the models going up here to about 1.7 degrees above average out there in the ENSO region. And we have the bottom one that goes down here to about a -1. Which one is more likely here? Well, the majority of the members of these models, all those red lines, the majority of them are up here in El Nino territory, okay, by late spring and into early summer. And to be honest, I don't have a whole lot of reason to disagree with that. So what I'm interested in seeing for next month is that when we take out these lower end members, which in my opinion are not going to verify, I would anticipate much better agreement up here in the spring and early summer with this push toward El Nino. Most of these models are on board with that. Some of these models initially had the La Nina too strong and lasting a little bit too long. So like I said, when we fast forward here another month and we take those lower end model anomalies out of here, I think we're going to have a better picture at least from the Copernicus 3, about where we're headed. Probably this is too high, but you know, maybe not by much. We may be up here between about positive zero point 0.5 and 1 degree Celsius by the time we head into early summer. This change is likely going to happen faster versus slower, in my opinion. We can already see it. And I talked about that about 5 days ago in the last episode of the Desert Farmer podcast, that we can already start to see those changes taking place. So let's look at the model temperature anomaly forecast from February through June here. So this is its forecast for February. And again, some of these models do have a hard time just seeing cold air in general. So you have to look for little signatures in here that would show up as cold air. I think where you're seeing the white here, which is basically just average, for a lack of a better term, that's where your cold signal is likely going to be. And where you're seeing these less warm colors, that's probably where you're going to have the best opportunity to see cold air dumped in. This is just kind of piggybacking off the pattern that we've been seeing for the majority of the winter. And then down here in the Southwest, that's where those warm anomalies are going to be most prevalent. Now, in February, could we see some cold air do this? I suppose it's possible. Historically speaking, as we see La Nina go away, we can have some late season cold air. That's built into some of those analogs that I shared with you. So could there be a significant blast of cold air drop down into the plains and make it farther west than what we've seen? Sure, I suppose. Have we seen anything of the sort so far this winter? And will we see anything of the sort the remainder of this month? Probably not. Okay. But February, we can still see it. There's March, and you can see we still see less warm colors up here across parts of the northern Rockies and northern plains, but we're still warmer across the southern tier. That's where some of those higher end warm anomalies are located. April, we still see the warm anomalies more focused out here to the west. All right. Less warm colors farther north, and you can kind of get that feeling that we can still see that. And as I've said repeatedly, the analogs can still favor some of that late season cold sneaking down here. By the time we push into May, notice there's a pretty good surge of warmer than average colors popping up here across parts of the Southwest and the Southwest High Plains for the month of May. June, even more focused. It expands farther to the north and northwest. So the Copernicus 3, that's your temperature forecast. What about precipitation anomalies from February through June? Let's look at that. So for February, we kind of have a return of this taking place, which was very prevalent during the month of December, where it was active here farther southwest across south central, southwest Canada, northern Rockies. Okay, this would be a big boost to the snow up here that is pretty much non-existent right now, from eastern Montana through the Dakotas, even dropping down here across parts of Wyoming. Notice here a little sliver of dryness here in the Southwest. I still think that for the most part, though, we will likely favor a drier than average pattern here across the Southwest, peaking out here into the far west and Southwest High Plains too for February. March, we see a little bit of that dryness redevelop here and expand. That would be from eastern New Mexico, West Texas, on up here through the Panhandle, southeast Colorado, southwest Kansas, and we are definitely more active here and here through these corridors for the month of March. For April, some of that dry signal refocuses back out here to the west. All right. And then we see that dry signal relax a little bit here in the middle part of the country, or at least on the western edge of the plains. Again, these are not high-end dry anomalies. Okay. This is the first layer when we're talking about a dry anomaly poking in here. And May, you see it kind of refocus a little farther to the northwest too. All right. Nice to see that we don't have any major ugly brown in this area here as we make this transition from La Nina to El Nino. And then for June, the dryness is still focused out here to the west, which would be consistent with our development toward El Nino, at least from a historical standpoint. But as I said, you're only looking at that first layer of drier than average. You're not way over here in that 70 to 100% tercile. So that's something to keep in mind here. But the fact that we don't see any large scale dry anomaly poking through here in the middle part of the country, that's obviously a good sign. And something else that I'm watching, do you see the wet anomalies that are showing up out here near the Baja, Western Mexico? Historically, as I know many of you know, the Eastern Pacific Ocean is more active when it comes to hurricane and tropical development when there is an El Nino present. So, with warmer than average water likely prevailing out here, all right, with a positive Pacific meridional mode, which is likely to continue, historically speaking, we can see some of that moisture early make its way up here from the south and southwest across parts of Mexico and maybe even entering the southwest, where you just get a better, wetter than average signal to pop up here a little bit earlier than others. And we saw some of this starting to show up when I talked about the European seasonal model and even the Canadian seasonal model. So that's not out of the realm of possibility right there. Okay. To put a bow on this and look at what the Climate Prediction Center drought outlook looked like through March. Again, this is still kind of, looking at this La Nina continuing during this period of time. So this was released a couple of weeks ago, and it's valid through the end of March. So where you're seeing the yellows, that's where drought development was most likely, at least the way the Climate Prediction Center saw it. I don't have a whole lot of reason to disagree with it, especially because our storm track has largely been void out here from the southwest high plains. We'll likely continue to get some relief up here in terms of drought relief with the pattern, and hopefully some drought relief here in the nation's midsection because it still has some dryness and drought that we're going to have to struggle through and for reversal. And fortunately, when you look at the way history should play out with this, we should start to get much more active in this sector here during March, especially during the month of March, even if we don't see a lot of an increase toward February, but especially by March. And while that's happening, we see continued dryness through this sector here. So while it may not be perfect, it really reinforces a lot of the things that I've been saying to you here on the Desert Farmer Forecast, for Desert Farmer Podcast for the past several months or so. Okay. So I know that this was a little bit of a shorter version of the Desert Farmer Podcast, but I hope you still enjoy the content in terms of where we are with the current weather pattern and how it's going to project going forward. I think all of this stuff ties together and is very important. If you have any questions or comments or feedback for me, a lot of you know how to get in touch with me, but for those of you who don't, please do use that contact information if you're interested in this. And if there's anything that I can do for you in terms of your individual farm, ranch, or business in terms of this kind of forecast information, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I have a lot of clients scattered all over the country. Most of those clients are in agriculture or work for agricultural entities because that's my background. Maybe you're listening to the Desert Farmer Podcast for the first time and you don't know that, but that's my background. Those are the folks that I really love to work with because it is my background. I understand it. I understand the weather forecast, how it applies, so on and so forth. So if there's something I can do for you, please don't hesitate to reach out to me and I can put you in touch with a lot of references that can vet me or my product if you are interested. Until I chat with you next time, folks, thanks for tuning in today. And I'll be chatting with you again real soon here on the Desert Farmer Podcast. Take care.